The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile waiting room of Morrison and Associates, casting harsh shadows across the worn leather chairs. Marcus Thompson adjusted his tie for the 5th time, his calloused hands betraying the nerves that his steady expression tried to hide. The suit he wore was his only one, purchased 3 years ago for his wife's funeral, and though he'd done his best to press out the wrinkles with an iron that barely worked, he knew it showed its age. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At 28, Marcus had the weathered look of someone who'd lived through more than most men twice his age. His dark hair was neatly combed but couldn't quite hide the premature gray that had started appearing after Sarah's diagnosis. His brown eyes, once bright with dreams and ambition, now carried the weight of responsibility that came with being the sole provider for his 6-year-old daughter, Emma. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with perfectly manicured nails and a smile that seemed rehearsed, glanced at him over her computer screen. Her expression was polite but distant, the kind of professional courtesy that made it clear she was simply doing her job. Marcus could feel her taking in his appearance, noting the scuffed shoes he'd polished that morning with petroleum jelly because he couldn't afford proper shoe polish, the slightly frayed cuffs of his dress shirt, and the way he kept checking the time on his old digital watch. Behind him, the glass doors of the corporate building offered a view of the bustling city center, where people in expensive suits hurried past with purposeful strides. This was a world Marcus had always dreamed of being part of, but one that felt impossibly distant from his current reality. He'd grown up in the projects on the east side of town, where opportunities were scarce and dreams were often crushed under the weight of circumstance. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket, and he discreetly checked the screen. A text from Mrs. Rodriguez, his elderly neighbor who was watching Emma. She's asking when Daddy will be home. I told her after his big important meeting. She's being so good, me Joe. Good luck. Marcus smiled despite his anxiety. Emma had been so excited when he told her about the interview, insisting on helping him pick out his tie that morning. She'd chosen the blue one with tiny silver dots, saying it matched his eyes and would bring him luck. The memory of her small hands smoothing down his lapels and her serious expression as she declared him the most handsome daddy in the whole world gave him strength. The job at Morrison and Associates represented everything Marcus had been working toward. As a financial consulting firm, they offered the kind of stable, well-paying position that could change his and Emma's life forever. No more 16-hour days juggling 3 different jobs. No more choosing between buying groceries and paying the electric bill. No more lying awake at night wondering how he'd afford Emma's school supplies or what would happen if she got sick and he couldn't take her to the doctor. For the past 2 years, since Sarah's death, Marcus had been grinding through community college courses at night while working construction during the day and cleaning offices on weekends. His hands bore the evidence of his labor, calloused and scarred from handling concrete and steel, stained with the remnants of honest work that paid barely enough to keep them afloat. But those same hands had also held textbooks until the early hours of morning, had typed countless essays on a laptop so old it took 5 minutes to start up, had filled out financial aid applications with the desperate hope that education might be his ticket to something better. The accounting degree he'd finally earned hadn't come easy. There were nights when Emma would fall asleep in the college library while he studied, curled up in a chair with her favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear named Mr. Buttons that had been a gift from her mother. There were mornings when he'd arrive at construction sites with his eyes burning from lack of sleep, downing cheap coffee and pushing through another day of physical labor that left his back aching and his hands raw. But every sacrifice had been worth it when he'd walked across that stage 3 months ago, seeing Emma in the audience jumping up and down with excitement, her missing front tooth giving her smile an endearing gap. She'd made him a card that night with crayons and construction paper, writing in her careful 6-year-old handwriting, "Congratulations, Daddy. Now you can have an office job like the people on TV." The receptionist's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. She answered with practiced efficiency, her voice dropping to a professional whisper as she spoke to whoever was on the other end. Marcus caught fragments of the conversation about quarterly reports and client meetings, the kind of business talk that he'd been studying and preparing for but had never actually been part of. He thought about the resume in his briefcase, printed on the highest quality paper he could afford at the local print shop. Every word had been carefully crafted, every experience polished to shine in the best possible light. Construction work became project management and resource coordination. His weekend cleaning jobs were described as facilities maintenance oversight. The online courses he'd taken in his spare time were prominently featured, along with his perfect GPA that had cost him countless hours of sleep and social interaction. What the resume couldn't capture was the reality of his daily life. The alarm clock that went off at 4:30 each morning so he could shower and dress quietly without waking Emma. The breakfast routine of toast and whatever fruit was on sale that week, eaten while he reviewed flashcards and Emma practiced her spelling words. The careful calculations he did each week at the grocery store, adding prices in his head and putting items back when the total crept too high. Emma understood more than a 6-year-old should about their financial situation. She never asked for the expensive toys her classmates had, never complained when her clothes came from the thrift store, never threw tantrums when he said they couldn't afford something. Instead, she'd become his little partner in their daily struggle, helping him count coupons and celebrating with him when they found a good deal on groceries. The weight of providing for her pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Every decision he made was filtered through the lens of what was best for Emma. The tiny apartment they shared had paper-thin walls and a heater that worked sporadically, but it was in the district with the good elementary school. His car was 15 years old and had over 200,000 miles on it, but it was reliable enough to get Emma to school and him to work. He owned 2 pairs of jeans, 3 work shirts, and this one suit, but Emma had a closet full of clothes that might have been second-hand but were always clean and well-maintained. The most difficult part wasn't the financial struggle, though. It was the loneliness. Sarah had been his partner in everything, the one person who understood his dreams and supported his ambitions even when they seemed impossible. She'd been the one to encourage him to go back to school, the one who'd believed he could be more than just another guy from the projects who worked with his hands until his body gave out. When the cancer took her, it had stolen more than just his wife. It had taken his best friend, his co-parent, his cheerleader, and his safety net all at once. The medical bills from her treatment had wiped out their small savings and put them deeper in debt than he'd ever imagined possible. Even with insurance, the specialists and treatments and medications had costs that seemed designed to crush families like his. In the months after her death, well-meaning friends and relatives had suggested that maybe Emma would be better off with her maternal grandparents, who lived in a nice suburb and had the financial resources to give her things Marcus couldn't provide. The suggestion had cut him deeper than any physical pain he'd ever experienced. Emma was all he had left of Sarah, the living embodiment of their love, and the thought of letting someone else raise her felt like giving up the most important part of himself. So he doubled down on his efforts to build a better life for them. He'd taken on extra shifts, enrolled in more courses, applied for every scholarship and grant program he could find. He'd swallowed his pride and accepted help from food banks when money was particularly tight, always making sure Emma understood that there was no shame in accepting assistance when you were working hard to improve your situation. The construction work had been brutal on his body. 12-hour days in the summer heat, carrying heavy materials up and down scaffolding, operating machinery that required constant attention and care. His co-workers were good men for the most part, but many of them had given up on the idea that life could be different. They talked about their jobs as something to endure rather than enjoy, counting down the years until retirement or disability, whichever came first. Marcus refused to accept that fate. He'd seen too many men in his neighborhood grow old and broken, their bodies worn out from decades of hard labor, their spirits crushed by the realization that they'd never escape the circumstances of their birth. He was determined to break that cycle, to show Emma that with enough determination and sacrifice, a person could change their destiny. The evening cleaning job had been equally challenging, but in different ways. Working in corporate offices after hours, he'd been surrounded by evidence of the life he was trying to build. Executive desks with family photos and expensive frames, awards and diplomas on walls, the lingering scent of success and prosperity. He'd clean these spaces while dreaming of the day when he might occupy one of them, when Emma might visit him at work and see him as more than just the daddy who always smelled like sawdust and cleaning supplies. Some nights, when he was particularly tired, he'd sit in one of those executive chairs for just a moment, closing his eyes and imagining what it would feel like to belong in that world. To wear a suit every day that fit properly and wasn't his only one. To have business cards with his name and impressive title. To be able to tell Emma that Daddy worked in an office now, that their days of financial struggle were finally over. The studying had been the hardest part of all. After working 16 hours and getting home to help Emma with her homework, make dinner, and get her ready for bed, finding the energy to open textbooks and focus on complex financial concepts had seemed almost impossible. But he developed a system, fueled by cheap coffee and the unwavering belief that education was his only path to something better. He'd study at the kitchen table while Emma slept, the apartment quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of neighbors moving around in the units above and below them. Mathematical formulas and accounting principles would blur together as exhaustion set in, but he'd push through, knowing that every page he read, every concept he mastered, was another step toward the life he wanted to build for his daughter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The online courses had been a godsend, allowing him to learn at his own pace and on his own schedule. He'd complete assignments during lunch breaks at construction sites, typing on his phone while eating sandwiches he'd packed that morning. He'd participate in discussion forums late at night, engaging with classmates who were mostly traditional college students living very different lives than his own. Sometimes he'd felt like an imposter in those digital classrooms, surrounded by people who seemed to have natural advantages he'd never possessed. But his professors had been encouraging, recognizing the unique perspective and work ethic he brought to his studies. His final project, a comprehensive financial analysis of small business sustainability in low-income communities, had drawn on his own experiences and observations, earning him the highest grade in the class. The degree ceremony had been one of the proudest moments of his life. Emma had worn her best dress, a pale yellow sundress with tiny flowers that Sarah's mother had sent for her birthday. She'd sat in the audience with Mrs. Rodriguez, both of them cheering loudly when his name was called. Walking across that stage, receiving the diploma that represented 2 years of sacrifice and determination, he'd felt like he was finally becoming the man Sarah had always believed he could be. But the degree was just the beginning. Finding a job that would utilize his new education and provide the stability he needed had proven to be another challenge entirely. His resume, despite his best efforts to present his experience in the most favorable light, still told the story of someone from outside the traditional corporate world. The gap between his background and the requirements for most entry-level positions in his field seemed impossibly wide. He'd applied to dozens of firms, crafting personalized cover letters and following up with phone calls and emails. Most applications disappeared into digital voids, never acknowledged or responded to. The few interviews he'd managed to secure had been learning experiences, teaching him about the unspoken rules and expectations of corporate culture. This interview at Morrison & Associates felt different, though. The initial phone screening had gone well, with the hiring manager, David Chen, seeming genuinely interested in Marcus's unconventional background and his determination to change careers. They'd scheduled this in-person meeting for what Chen had described as a comprehensive evaluation, which Marcus understood to mean his one real shot at landing the position. The job itself was exactly what he'd been hoping for. Junior financial analyst, with responsibilities that would draw on everything he'd learned in his coursework. The salary, while modest by corporate standards, would be more money than Marcus had ever made in a single year. More importantly, it came with benefits that would change everything for Emma. Health insurance that would cover her regular checkups and any emergencies that might arise. Dental coverage so she could see a dentist regularly instead of only when problems became too painful to ignore. Even a small retirement plan that would allow Marcus to start building something for their future. But it wasn't just about the money and benefits. This job would give Emma a different model of what work could be. Instead of seeing her father leave before dawn and return after sunset, exhausted and dirty from manual labor, she would see him in professional clothes, carrying a briefcase, working with his mind instead of just his hands. She would grow up understanding that education and determination could open doors that had seemed permanently closed. The receptionist hung up her phone and looked at Marcus with that same professional smile. "Mr. Thompson? Mr. Chen will see you now. Just down the hall, third door on your right." Marcus stood up, straightening his jacket and picking up his briefcase. The leather case was another investment he'd agonized over, knowing that appearance mattered in the corporate world but struggling to justify spending money they didn't have on what was essentially a prop. In the end, he'd found it at a pawn shop, slightly worn but still professional looking, for a fraction of the cost of a new one. Walking down the hallway, he passed offices with glass walls that offered glimpses into the working lives of successful professionals. Men and women in expensive suits sat at computers, spoke on phones with important-sounding conversations, attended meetings in conference rooms with polished tables and ergonomic chairs. This was the world he wanted to join, the environment where he could use his education to build a better future. The hallway was decorated with awards and certificates, evidence of the firm's success and reputation. Morrison and Associates had been in business for over 20 years, building a client base that included some of the city's most prominent businesses and wealthy individuals. Working here wouldn't just be a job, it would be an entry point into a network of connections and opportunities that could shape the rest of his career. Marcus thought about the conversation he'd had with Emma that morning while she ate her cereal, and he reviewed his notes one final time. She'd asked him what would happen if he got the job, and he'd explained that it would mean they could move to a better apartment, maybe one with a yard where she could play outside safely. It might mean family vacations someday, and certainly would mean she wouldn't have to worry about whether they could afford things like school supplies or clothes that fit properly. But Emma, wise beyond her years, had asked the question that had been weighing on his mind. "Will you still be my daddy if you become an office person?" Her innocence had cut straight to his deepest fear, that in trying to give her a better life, he might somehow lose the closeness they'd built through shared struggle and mutual dependence. He'd knelt down to her level, looking into eyes that were so much like Sarah's it sometimes took his breath away, and promised her that nothing would ever change how much he loved her or how important she was to him. That becoming successful didn't mean becoming different, just becoming able to provide better for the people you cared about. Now, standing outside David Chen's office, Marcus felt the weight of that promise. This interview wasn't just about his own dreams and ambitions, it was about proving to Emma that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. It was about honoring Sarah's memory by building the kind of life she'd always believed they could have together. He knocked on the door, hearing Chen's voice invite him in. Taking a deep breath, Marcus turned the handle and stepped into what he hoped would be the beginning of everything he'd been working toward. David Chen's office was exactly what Marcus had expected from a senior partner at a prestigious firm, yet it still managed to intimidate him in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. The space was expansive by any standard Marcus was familiar with, probably larger than his and Emma's entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows dominated one wall, offering a panoramic view of the city skyline that stretched out like a promise of possibility and success. The furniture was clearly expensive, though Chen had chosen pieces that projected competence rather than ostentation. A substantial mahogany desk occupied the center of the room, its surface organized with the kind of precise attention to detail that spoke of a methodical mind. Behind it sat Chen himself, a man in his early 40s with silver-rimmed glasses and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of making important decisions. Chen stood as Marcus entered, extending his hand with a firm grip that lasted exactly the appropriate amount of time. His suit was perfectly tailored, probably costing more than Marcus made in a month, but his manner was surprisingly warm and welcoming. This was someone who had learned to put people at ease while simultaneously evaluating their worth, a skill that probably served him well in both client relationships and personnel decisions. "Marcus, thank you for coming in today. Please, have a seat." Chen gestured to one of two leather chairs positioned in front of his desk. The chair was more comfortable than anything Marcus had ever owned, and he found himself consciously trying not to show how impressed he was by the luxury of it. The walls of the office told the story of Chen's professional journey. Diplomas from prestigious universities were displayed alongside photographs of him with important-looking people at various corporate events. Awards and recognitions from professional organizations occupied their own section, while a bookshelf held what appeared to be a carefully curated collection of business and financial texts alongside a few personal touches that hinted at interests beyond work. "I have to tell you, your application really stood out," Chen began, settling back into his own chair and opening what Marcus assumed was his file. "It's not often we see someone with your combination of life experience and academic achievement. Your professors spoke very highly of you in their recommendations." Marcus felt a flutter of hope mixed with anxiety. The recommendations had been another hurdle he'd had to navigate carefully. Most of his classmates had professional references from internships or previous white-collar jobs, while Marcus had to rely on professors who knew him primarily through coursework and online interactions. He'd been afraid that academic recommendations alone wouldn't carry the same weight as professional ones. "I appreciate you taking the time to consider my application," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the nervousness he felt. "I know my background is probably different from most of your candidates, but I believe that difference could be an asset. I've learned to work under pressure, manage multiple priorities, and find creative solutions to problems, skills I developed out of necessity that I think would translate well to this position." Chen nodded approvingly, making notes on what Marcus assumed was his evaluation form. "Tell me about that. You've been juggling quite a lot over the past few years: full-time manual labor, part-time school, single parenthood. How did you manage it all without burning out?" The question hit closer to home than Chen probably realized. Marcus had burned out, multiple times, usually late at night when the exhaustion became so overwhelming that he'd sit at his kitchen table staring at textbooks with tears of frustration in his eyes. But those moments had been temporary setbacks, not permanent defeats, because quitting had never been an option. "Honestly, there were times when I didn't think I could manage it," Marcus admitted. "But I had to keep my focus on the long-term goal. Every day I didn't give up was a day closer to being able to provide better for my daughter." When you have that kind of motivation, you find reserves of energy you didn't know you had. He thought about those late nights when Emma would wake up and find him studying, padding into the kitchen in her pajamas to check on him. She'd learned not to ask why Daddy was always tired, instead bringing him glasses of water or simply sitting quietly nearby while he worked. Her presence had often been the thing that kept him going when his energy flagged and his motivation wavered. "Speaking of your daughter," Chin continued, "how do you plan to balance the demands of a professional position with your parental responsibilities? This role will require some flexibility in terms of hours, occasional client meetings in the evenings, possibly some travel down the line." It was a question Marcus had been expecting and dreading in equal measure. The reality was that his current childcare arrangements were precarious at best, depending almost entirely on the kindness of Mrs. Rodriguez and the flexible schedules of his blue-collar jobs. A traditional office position would require a complete restructuring of his daily routine and childcare needs. "I understand the demands of the position," Marcus said carefully. "I've already begun exploring daycare options and after-school programs. My daughter is very adaptable, and she understands that Daddy's work is important. I've never missed a deadline or failed to complete a project because of my personal responsibilities, and I don't intend to start now." What he didn't mention was the complex calculations he'd already done regarding childcare costs. Quality daycare for Emma would eat up nearly a third of his potential salary, but it would still leave them significantly better off than their current situation. More importantly, it would provide Emma with social interaction and educational opportunities that she wasn't getting in her current informal arrangement. Chen made more notes, his expression neutral but not unfriendly. "Your academic record is impressive. Graduating summa cum laude while working full-time is no small achievement. But academic success doesn't always translate to professional competence. How do you think your theoretical knowledge will apply to real-world client situations?" This was the heart of Marcus's vulnerability, and both men knew it. Despite his education and natural intelligence, Marcus had no professional experience in financial services. He'd never sat across from a wealthy client discussing investment strategies, never prepared reports for board meetings, never navigated the complex interpersonal dynamics of corporate culture. "You're right that I don't have traditional experience," Marcus acknowledged. "But I do have something that might be just as valuable: perspective. I understand what it's like to make every dollar count, to weigh financial decisions not just in terms of maximum return but in terms of real-world impact on families. I think that understanding could help me connect with clients in ways that might surprise you. He was thinking of the clients he'd observed during his evening cleaning job, overhearing conversations about investment portfolios that represented more money than his entire neighborhood saw in a year. Many of those conversations had seemed abstract, focused on numbers and percentages without acknowledgement of the human impact of financial decisions. Marcus believed his background could bring a different perspective to those discussions. Additionally, Marcus continued, I may not have corporate experience, but I do have extensive experience managing resources under pressure. In construction, a single mistake can cost thousands of dollars and endanger lives. You learn to be precise, to double-check everything, and to communicate clearly about potential problems before they become disasters. Those skills seem directly applicable to financial analysis and client management. Chen leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with the kind of analytical gaze that probably made less prepared candidates squirm. Marcus met his eyes steadily, drawing on the confidence he'd developed through years of facing challenges that had seemed insurmountable. Let's talk about some specific scenarios, Chen said, opening what appeared to be a case study. Imagine you have a client who's consistently making poor investment choices against your advice. They're friendly and pay their fees on time, but their stubbornness is costing them significant returns. How do you handle that relationship? Marcus considered the question carefully. It was exactly the kind of interpersonal challenge that his academic coursework had touched on but never fully addressed. In his blue-collar jobs, straight talk was usually appreciated, but he understood that corporate clients might require more diplomatic approaches. First, I'd want to understand why they're resistant to my recommendations, Marcus said. Sometimes what looks like stubbornness is actually fear or lack of understanding. I'd take time to really listen to their concerns and make sure I was explaining my recommendations in terms they could relate to and trust. He thought about his own interactions with professionals over the years, doctors, lawyers, social workers, and how frustrated he'd become when they spoke in jargon he didn't understand or made assumptions about his level of knowledge. The best professionals had been those who took time to meet him where he was and explain things in ways he could comprehend and evaluate. If education and communication didn't resolve the issue, I'd document my recommendations clearly and make sure the client understood the potential consequences of their decisions. Ultimately, it's their money and their choice, but my job would be to ensure they were making informed decisions rather than uninformed ones. Chen nodded approvingly. Good answer. Now let's talk about something more technical. He pulled out a financial statement and slid it across the desk. Take a few minutes to look at this and tell me what concerns you might have if this company approached us for investment advice. Marcus studied the document carefully, drawing on everything he'd learned about financial analysis and ratio calculation. The numbers told a story, and not necessarily a positive one. The company showed strong revenue growth, but their debt-to-equity ratio was concerning, and their cash flow patterns suggested they might be growing faster than their infrastructure could support. Several red flags, Marcus said after a few minutes. Their current ratio suggests potential liquidity problems, and the rapid increase in accounts receivable relative to sales could indicate collection issues. The debt load is manageable now, but if their growth rate slows or if they hit any major obstacles, they could find themselves overextended quickly. He continued his analysis, pointing out specific line items and explaining his reasoning. Chen listened intently, occasionally asking follow-up questions that tested Marcus's understanding of the underlying concepts. It was exactly the kind of technical discussion Marcus had been preparing for, and he felt confident in his responses. Very thorough, Chen said when Marcus finished. You clearly understand the fundamentals. But understanding numbers is only part of this job. A significant portion of our success depends on building relationships and managing client expectations. Tell me about a time when you had to deliver disappointing news to someone who was counting on you. The question brought back painful memories that Marcus had hoped wouldn't come up during the interview. But Chen deserved an honest answer, and Marcus's instinct told him that authenticity would serve him better than corporate speak in this situation. When my wife was dying, Marcus said quietly, there came a point when I had to tell my 6-year-old daughter that mommy wasn't going to get better. It was the hardest conversation I've ever had, but I learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is tell the truth clearly and compassionately, even when that truth is difficult to hear. The office fell silent for a moment. Chen removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture that Marcus interpreted as thoughtful consideration rather than discomfort. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been, Chen said finally. But you're right that the skill translates. Clients need to trust that we'll tell them the truth about their financial situations, even when that truth isn't what they want to hear. How do you think you'd handle a client who wanted to make investments that you knew were likely to lose them money? Marcus thought about Emma's piggy bank, where she carefully saved every coin she found or received, trusting him to help her make good decisions about her small treasures. The responsibility of managing someone else's financial security, even on a much larger scale, felt familiar in some ways. I'd treat their money the way I'd want someone to treat mine, Marcus replied. With respect, careful analysis, and honest communication about risks and opportunities. I'd make sure they understood not just what I was recommending, but why, and what the alternatives looked like. Ultimately, building long-term trust is more valuable than avoiding short-term difficult conversations. The interview continued for another hour, covering everything from technical knowledge to hypothetical client scenarios to Marcus's long-term career goals. Chen's questions were probing but fair, designed to test both competence and character. Marcus felt increasingly confident as the conversation progressed, drawing on his combination of academic knowledge and life experience to provide thoughtful, nuanced answers. When Chen finally closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, Marcus sensed that the formal portion of the interview was ending. But instead of the usual closing pleasantries, Chen's expression became more serious. Marcus, I'm going to be frank with you, Chen began. Your qualifications are solid, and your answers today have been impressive. But I'd be lying if I said your background wasn't a concern for some people here. This is a conservative firm with a very specific culture and client base. Some of our clients might have preconceptions about someone with your background. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. This was the conversation he'd been dreading but expecting. Despite all the progress society claimed to have made, class prejudice remained a powerful force in professional settings. His education and intelligence couldn't completely overcome the assumptions people made based on his address, his accent, or the calluses on his hands. I understand your concern, Marcus said carefully. But I think those preconceptions might work in our favor once clients actually interact with me. People appreciate authenticity, and I can offer them a perspective they're unlikely to get from someone who's never had to worry about making rent or feeding their family. Chen nodded slowly. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Because honestly, I think this firm could benefit from someone with your background. We've become very good at managing money for people who already have it, but we're less effective at understanding the needs of clients who are building wealth for the first time. Marcus felt a surge of hope. This was the opening he'd been waiting for, the chance to position his background as an asset rather than a liability. The fastest-growing segment of our potential client base, Chen continued, consists of people who've achieved financial success through entrepreneurship, professional advancement, or simply hard work and smart saving. These aren't people who inherited wealth or grew up in financially sophisticated families. They need advisors who understand their perspective and can communicate with them effectively. The conversation was taking a turn Marcus hadn't expected. Instead of being seen as a risk to be managed, his background was being positioned as a strategic advantage. It was a perspective he'd hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. I think I could connect with those clients in meaningful ways, Marcus agreed. I understand what it feels like to be intimidated by financial jargon and to worry about being taken advantage of by professionals who don't respect your intelligence. I also understand the emotional significance of financial milestones for people who've worked hard to achieve them. Chen smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Marcus had seen from him during the entire interview. Exactly. And that's why, despite some internal resistance, I've been pushing to expand our hiring criteria to include candidates like you. Marcus felt his heart rate increase. The phrasing suggested that a decision had already been made, but he didn't want to assume anything premature. "The position is yours if you want it," Chen said simply. "The salary we discussed, full benefits starting immediately, and a clear path for advancement based on performance. You'll start in our junior analyst program, but I expect you to move up quickly once you get acclimated to our systems and clients." For a moment, Marcus couldn't speak. 2 years of sacrifice, exhaustion, and determination had led to this moment, but now that it was here, it felt almost surreal. The life he'd been working toward, the future he'd promised Emma, was suddenly within reach. "I accept," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I won't disappoint you." Chen stood up, extending his hand again. "I don't think you will. Welcome to Morrison and Associates, Marcus. I think you're going to do very well here." As they shook hands, Marcus thought about Emma waiting at home with Mrs. Rodriguez, probably doing homework at the kitchen table where he'd spent so many late nights studying. Tonight, instead of bringing home exhaustion and worry, he'd be bringing home news that would change everything for both of them. The practical details of starting his new job, schedules, training programs, administrative requirements seemed to blur together as Chen explained them. Marcus tried to focus, but part of his mind was already racing ahead to the phone call he'd make to Emma, to the conversation they'd have about what this meant for their future, to the moment when he could finally tell her that all his promises about things getting better had come true. But as he prepared to leave Chen's office, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the window behind Chen's desk. The man looking back at him was the same person who'd walked in an hour earlier, but everything had changed. The father who'd left home that morning worried about bills and uncertain about the future was now someone with a career, health insurance, and the ability to provide his daughter with opportunities he'd only dreamed about. Walking back through the hallway, past the offices filled with successful professionals, Marcus no longer felt like an outsider looking in. These were his colleagues now, this was his workplace, and this was the beginning of the life he'd been building through years of sacrifice and determination. The receptionist looked up as he passed, and Marcus wondered if she could see the change in him, if his success was somehow visible in his posture or expression. Everything looked the same as when he'd arrived, but his entire world had shifted in the span of a single conversation. Outside the building, the city street buzzed with its usual afternoon activity. People hurried past on sidewalks, cars moved through traffic, the rhythm of urban life continued unchanged. But for Marcus, stepping onto that sidewalk felt like stepping into a completely different existence than the one he'd left behind that morning. He pulled out his phone to call Mrs. Rodriguez and let her know he'd be home soon, but his hands were shaking slightly with excitement and residual adrenaline. The number for his old life was the same, but the man making the call was someone entirely new. The drive home felt like floating through a dream that Marcus was afraid might dissolve if he acknowledged it too directly. His 15-year-old Honda Civic, with its faded blue paint and the passenger door that required a specific technique to open properly, had never felt more luxurious. Every red light gave him another moment to process what had just happened, to let the reality of his new position settle into his consciousness like sediment finding its place at the bottom of still water. Marcus had always been a careful driver, but today he found himself being even more cautious than usual. The last thing he needed was an accident or traffic ticket to mar this perfect day. Besides, he had precious cargo waiting for him at home, and Emma deserved to hear this news from a father who arrived safely and wholly present for the moment that would change both their lives forever. The neighborhoods he passed through told the story of the city's economic geography in reverse. Leaving the gleaming downtown district where Morrison and Associates occupied the 32nd floor of a glass tower, he drove through the transitional areas where small businesses and converted warehouses housed the kinds of services that kept the corporate world functioning. Then came the older residential areas where working families lived in houses built in the 1940s and 50s, many of them beautifully maintained despite their age, others showing the wear of decades and limited resources for upkeep. Finally, he reached his own neighborhood, where the American dream felt simultaneously within reach and impossibly distant. The apartment complex where he and Emma lived wasn't the worst place in the city, but it wasn't somewhere anyone aspired to stay long-term. Built in the 1970s as affordable housing, It had aged into something that served families who were either starting out or struggling to maintain their footing in an economy that seemed designed to test their resilience at every turn. The parking lot's asphalt was cracked and patched in so many places that it resembled a jigsaw puzzle made of different shades of black and gray. Marcus pulled into his assigned space, number 47, next to Mrs. Rodriguez's aging Toyota Camry that she kept running through a combination of mechanical knowledge inherited from her late husband and sheer determination. The car was nearly as old as his own, but she maintained it with the kind of meticulous care that came from understanding that reliable transportation wasn't a luxury but a necessity for survival in a city built around automobile access. As he climbed the exterior stairs to the second floor, Marcus could hear the familiar sounds of the complex coming alive in the late afternoon. Television programs in both English and Spanish filtered through thin walls, children played in the small courtyard area between buildings, and someone was cooking something that smelled like cumin and garlic in home. These sounds had been the backdrop of his life for the past 3 years, ever since Sarah's medical bills had forced them to move from the small house they'd been renting closer to downtown. At first, the move had felt like failure, like evidence that he wasn't man enough to protect his family from the financial catastrophe that serious illness could bring to even prepared, hard-working people. But over time, he'd come to appreciate the community that existed within these walls. Neighbors looked out for each other's children, shared tools and ingredients in occasional meals, created networks of mutual support that made survival possible and sometimes even pleasant. Mrs. Rodriguez's door was directly across from his own, and he could see light glowing warmly behind her curtains. Elena Rodriguez was 73 years old, a widow who'd raised 4 children largely on her own after her husband died in an industrial accident when their youngest was still in elementary school. She'd worked as a school custodian for 35 years, saving enough money to buy her apartment when the complex went through a conversion to condominiums in the early 2000s. She'd become Emma's unofficial grandmother and Marcus's guardian angel, stepping in to help with childcare when his irregular work schedule made conventional arrangements impossible. More than that, she'd become a source of wisdom and perspective, someone who'd navigated many of the same challenges he faced and emerged with her dignity and optimism intact. Marcus knocked softly on her door, knowing that Emma would be finishing her homework at Mrs. Rodriguez's small dining table, probably with a glass of milk and whatever homemade cookies or pastries Elena had prepared that week. The older woman was an extraordinary cook, drawing on recipes she'd learned from her mother and grandmother, adapted over the decades to work within the constraints of a limited budget. The door opened to reveal Elena's kind face, lined with the evidence of 7 decades of laughter and worry and the deep satisfaction that came from a life spent caring for others. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for as long as Marcus had known her, and her dark eyes sparkled with the intelligence and humor that had helped her navigate every challenge life had presented. "Marcus, Mijo, you're glowing," she said immediately, her voice carrying the slight accent that revealed her childhood in a household where Spanish was the primary language. "Something good happened today, I can see it in your face." Before he could respond, Emma appeared behind Elena, her small face lighting up with the pure joy that children reserve for the return of beloved parents. At 6 years old, she was all arms and legs and boundless energy, with Sarah's green eyes and Marcus's darker hair that she wore in 2 braids that Elena helped her maintain each morning. "Daddy. Mrs. Rodriguez helped me with my math homework and we made cookies shaped like butterflies." Emma launched herself into his arms with the complete trust and enthusiasm that never failed to remind Marcus why every sacrifice had been worthwhile. Her small body fit perfectly against his chest, and he breathed in the scent of vanilla and childhood that always clung to her hair. "Did you have your important meeting?" she asked, pulling back to study his face with the serious attention she brought to everything that mattered to her father. "Did you wear the lucky tie I picked out?" Marcus looked down at the blue tie with silver dots that Emma had selected that morning, declaring it perfect for making good impressions. She'd been so serious about the choice, examining several options with the concentration of a fashion consultant before settling on this one because it matched his eyes and would remind him that she was thinking about him during his big day. "I did wear the lucky tie," Marcus confirmed, loosening it slightly as Elena invited him into her apartment. "And I think it worked exactly like you said it would." Elena's small living room was a testament to a life lived with attention to beauty despite limited resources. The furniture was older but well-maintained, covered with crocheted doilies and small decorative pillows that she'd made herself. Photographs of her children and grandchildren covered every available surface, creating a visual history of a family that had grown and prospered under her devoted care. The walls held religious icons and family portraits alongside artwork created by various grandchildren over the years. Emma settled onto the couch next to Marcus, her small hand finding his larger one with the automatic affection that had developed during their years as a team of two. Elena bustled around the small kitchen area, preparing coffee for the adults and chocolate milk for Emma, moving with the efficient grace of someone who'd spent decades managing a household on careful planning and limited resources. "So tell us about this meeting," Elena said, settling into her favorite chair with her own cup of coffee. "Emma has been talking about it all day, explaining to me how her daddy is going to work in a tall building with elevators and everything." Marcus looked at his daughter, whose eyes were wide with anticipation and complete faith that whatever news he brought would be good news. The weight of her trust was both inspiring and terrifying, a reminder that his decisions affected not just his own life but the future of this small person who depended on him for everything from daily meals to long-term security. "Well," Marcus began, drawing out the moment partly for dramatic effect but mostly to give himself time to find the right words, "it looks like Emma was right about the lucky tie. Mr. Chen offered me the job." For a moment, the small apartment was completely silent. Then Emma erupted in celebration, jumping up and down on the couch with the unrestrained joy that only children can express. "I knew it. I knew the tie would work. Does this mean we can get a house with a yard? Can I get a puppy now? Are you going to wear fancy clothes every day?" Elena's reaction was quieter but no less meaningful. Tears gathered in her dark eyes as she reached over to squeeze Marcus's hand, her weathered fingers conveying decades of understanding about what this moment represented. She'd watched him struggle through the darkest period of his life, had seen him choose hope over despair again and again, had believed in his potential even when he'd struggled to believe in it himself. "Mijo, I'm so proud of you," she said simply. "Sarah would be so proud too. You did it, Marcus. You really did it." The mention of Sarah brought the familiar mixture of joy and sorrow that accompanied every major milestone in Marcus's life. His wife should have been here to share this moment, should have been the first person he called with the news, should have been planning with him about how this change would improve their family's future. Instead, her absence was a constant reminder of both what he'd lost and what he was fighting to preserve for Emma. Emma, sensing the shift in mood that always accompanied mentions of her mother, climbed into Marcus's lap and wrapped her small arms around his neck. "Mommy would be happy, wouldn't she, Daddy? She always said you were the smartest person she knew." Marcus held his daughter close, remembering Sarah's unwavering faith in his potential even when his own confidence faltered. She'd been the one to suggest he go back to school, the one who'd researched financial aid programs and degree requirements, the one who'd insisted that his intelligence and work ethic would eventually open doors that seemed permanently closed. Her belief in him had become the foundation of his belief in himself. "Yes, sweetheart, Mommy would be very happy," Marcus confirmed, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. "She always believed that hard work and education could help us build a better life, and today we found out she was right." Elena stood up and moved to her small kitchen, returning with a plate of the butterfly cookies she and Emma had made that afternoon. The cookies were decorated with colored icing and small candies, clearly the work of a 6-year-old who'd been more concerned with creativity than precision. But they represented something precious, the kind of simple, loving activity that had filled Emma's afternoons while Marcus worked to build their future. "We need to celebrate," Elena declared, setting the plate on the coffee table between them. "Emma, go get the special glasses from my china cabinet. Tonight we're going to have a proper party." While Emma carefully retrieved the delicate glasses that Elena reserved for important occasions, Marcus found himself overwhelmed by gratitude for this woman who'd become so much more than a neighbor. Elena had stepped into the void left by Sarah's death, providing not just practical help with childcare but emotional support for both father and daughter during their most difficult period. When Emma's biological grandmother had suggested that perhaps the little girl would be better off in a more stable environment, Elena had been the one to remind Marcus that love and dedication mattered more than financial resources. When bill collectors had called and Marcus had felt like he was drowning in debt and responsibility, Elena had been the one to sit with him at her kitchen table and help him create budgets and payment plans that made survival possible. Emma returned with 3 glasses, handling them with the exaggerated care of a child who understood that these objects were special and breakable. Elena filled them with apple juice, transforming the simple beverage into something ceremonial through the formality of her presentation. "A toast," Elena announced, raising her glass solemnly, "to Marcus Thompson, the hardest working man I know, and to Emma Thompson, the best daughter anyone could ask for. And to Sarah, who's watching over you both and smiling today." They clinked their glasses together, Emma giggling at the musical sound the crystal made when it touched. For Marcus, the moment felt like a bridge between his past struggles and future possibilities, a recognition that success hadn't required him to leave behind the people and values that mattered most. As they sipped their apple juice and ate butterfly cookies, Emma bombarded Marcus with questions about his new job. Would he have his own office? Would he meet famous people? Could she visit him at work sometime? Would he have a secretary like the people on television? Marcus answered each question patiently, trying to explain the reality of his position in terms a 6-year-old could understand while managing his own excitement about the opportunities that lay ahead. "The most important thing," Marcus explained, "is that this job will help us have a more comfortable life. We'll be able to move to a better apartment, maybe even rent a small house someday. You'll be able to take dance classes or music lessons if you want to. We won't have to worry so much about money for things like doctor visits and school supplies." Emma's eyes widened at the possibilities. She'd learned not to ask for things they couldn't afford, but Marcus had seen her looking wistfully at other children who took dance classes or played soccer in organized leagues. The idea that such activities might soon be within reach for his daughter filled him with a satisfaction deeper than any personal achievement could provide. "Does this mean you won't have to work on Saturdays anymore?" Emma asked, referring to his weekend cleaning job that had often required him to leave her with Elena for several hours while he earned the extra money that made their budget work. "That's exactly what it means," Marcus confirmed. "Saturdays will be for us for going to the park, or the library, or maybe even the movies sometimes." Elena watched this exchange with the satisfaction of someone who'd invested deeply in others' happiness and was now seeing the return on that investment. She'd spent countless Saturday afternoons entertaining Emma while Marcus worked, never complaining about the responsibility but clearly understanding the sacrifice it represented for both father and daughter. "And Sundays," Elena added with a mischievous smile, "will still be for family dinner here, if you want. I'm not giving up my time with my honorary granddaughter just because her daddy got fancy." Emma clapped her hands in delight. Sunday dinners at Elena's had become their most treasured weekly tradition, featuring elaborate meals that Elena prepared with love and the understanding that good food shared with people you care about was one of life's most reliable sources of happiness. The older woman's cooking had introduced Emma to flavors and dishes from Elena's Mexican heritage, broadening her palate and her understanding of the world beyond their immediate neighborhood. As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself studying the small apartment that had been Emma's second home for the past 2 years. The space was tiny by most standards, probably smaller than his future office at Morrison & Associates, but it had been filled with more warmth and genuine care than many mansions could claim. Elena's limited resources had been stretched to accommodate not just her own needs but the overflow from Marcus and Emma's life, creating a support system that had made their survival possible. "Elena," Marcus said seriously, "I want you to know that this changes nothing about how much we appreciate everything you've done for us. I know Emma loves you, and I hope you'll continue to be part of our lives no matter where we end up living." The older woman's eyes filled with tears again. "Mijo, you and Emma are family now. Distance won't change that. But I have to ask, when you move to your fancy new neighborhood, will you remember the people who helped you get there?" The question carried decades of experience with people who'd improved their circumstances and then distanced themselves from reminders of more difficult times. Marcus understood Elena's concern, had seen it happen in his own extended family and community. Success sometimes came with the temptation to reinvent yourself completely, to pretend that your current status had always been your reality. Elena, if I ever become the kind of person who forgets where I came from or who helped me along the way, I give you permission to remind me, Marcus said firmly. Emma and I are going to have more opportunities now, but we're not going to become different people. We're just going to become more secure versions of who we already are. Emma, who'd been listening to this adult conversation with the serious attention she brought to topics she sensed were important even when she didn't fully understand them, climbed down from Marcus's lap and walked over to Elena's chair. Mrs. Rodriguez, when we get our new house, can you come visit us? And can you teach me to make more cookies? I want to learn all your recipes so I can cook for Daddy when I get bigger. Elena gathered Emma into her arms, holding her close and rocking slightly in the way that grandmothers throughout history have comforted and reassured children. Of course, mi amor. I'll teach you everything I know about cooking, and about taking care of the people you love, and about being strong when things get difficult. Marcus watched this exchange between the two most important females in his life and felt a profound sense of continuity. His success at Morrison & Associates would change many things about their daily routine and long-term prospects, but it wouldn't alter the fundamental relationships and values that had sustained them through their most challenging period. As the celebration continued into the evening, Marcus found himself thinking about the practical details that would need to be managed over the next few weeks. He'd need to give notice at his construction job, a conversation that would be both satisfying and somewhat bittersweet. The men he'd worked alongside for the past several years had become friends, and while they'd understand his decision to pursue better opportunities, he'd miss the camaraderie and straightforward nature of physical labor. The weekend cleaning job would be easier to leave behind, though he'd need to give his supervisor adequate notice to find a replacement. Those late-night hours spent in corporate offices had provided valuable insight into professional environments, but they'd also represented time away from Emma that he'd never quite been comfortable with. More immediately, he'd need to address the childcare situation. Elena would continue to be important in Emma's life, but she was 73 years old and shouldn't be expected to provide full-time care for an active 6-year-old. The local elementary school offered an after-school program that would cover the hours between Emma's dismissal and Marcus's return from work, but it would require advance registration and fees that would stretch their budget even with his improved salary. Then there were the wardrobe considerations. His single suit had served adequately for the interview, but working in a corporate environment would require a more extensive professional wardrobe. The expense would be significant initially, but Marcus viewed it as an investment in his career prospects rather than simply a cost. Emma had fallen asleep in Elena's arms, exhausted by the excitement of the day and the sugar from multiple butterfly cookies. Her small face was peaceful in sleep, free from the worries that had sometimes clouded her expression during their most difficult financial periods. Looking at her, Marcus felt the familiar surge of protective love that had motivated every decision he'd made since Sarah's death. "She's been so worried about you," Elena said softly, adjusting Emma's position so she was more comfortable. "She doesn't say much about it, but I can tell. Children understand more than we think they do about their parents' stress and struggles. Today was good for her too, seeing that all your hard work was leading somewhere." Marcus nodded, remembering the nights when he'd thought Emma was asleep only to find her standing in her bedroom doorway, watching him study at the kitchen table with an expression of concern that seemed far too mature for her age. She'd learned to be quiet during his study sessions, to entertain herself when he was too exhausted for interactive play, to accept explanations about why they couldn't afford certain things without argument or complaints. "I never wanted her to have to be so grown up so young," Marcus said. "But maybe some of the lessons she's learned will serve her well as she gets older. She understands the value of hard work and education in ways that a lot of kids her age don't." Elena smiled, smoothing Emma's hair with gentle fingers. "She's learned that love means sacrifice, that families stick together through difficult times, and that her daddy will always find a way to take care of her. Those are good lessons, Marcus. Don't feel guilty about giving her those gifts." As the evening wound down, Marcus carefully lifted his sleeping daughter from Elena's arms and carried her across the hall to their own apartment. Emma stirred briefly as he tucked her into her small bed, mumbling something about butterfly cookies and lucky ties before settling back into deep sleep. Their apartment felt different somehow, as if the news of his job offer had already begun transforming the space. The same furniture, the same cramped layout, the same water stain on the ceiling that the landlord kept promising to fix. Nothing had physically changed, but Marcus's perception of their circumstances had shifted dramatically. Standing in Emma's doorway, watching her sleep peacefully under the quilt that Sarah's mother had made for her second birthday, Marcus allowed himself to fully experience the magnitude of what had happened that day. For the first time in years, the future felt bright with possibility rather than shadowed by uncertainty. He thought about the phone calls he'd need to make, starting with Sarah's parents who lived 3 states away and maintained contact primarily through birthday cards and occasional awkward phone conversations. They were good people who loved Emma, but their suggestion that she might be better off with them had created a tension that Marcus had never quite managed to resolve. Tonight's news would prove that he'd been right to insist on keeping his family together, that love and determination could indeed overcome economic disadvantage. His own parents had died in a car accident when he was 22, too young to have developed the kind of adult relationship that might have provided support during his current struggles. But he thought they would have been proud of what he'd accomplished, proud that their son had refused to accept limitations that others might have considered permanent. The small living room contained the evidence of their careful financial management over the past 2 years. Furniture purchased at thrift stores and cleaned and maintained with pride. Books borrowed from the library rather than purchased new. A television that was older than Emma but still functional for the educational programs and occasional movies that comprised their entertainment budget. Marcus settled onto the couch with his laptop, a refurbished machine that had served him well through his coursework and job search. He wanted to review the materials Chen had given him about Morrison and Associates' orientation program and the specific responsibilities of his new position. The transition from student to professional would require adjustment, and he wanted to be as prepared as possible for his first day. But as he opened the laptop and waited for it to boot up, Marcus found his mind wandering to the larger implications of his career change. This job wasn't just about financial stability, though that was certainly important. It was about Emma seeing her father as a professional, someone who worked with his mind rather than his hands, someone who commanded respect in environments that valued education and expertise. More than that, it was about Marcus finally becoming the man he'd always believed he could be, the person Sarah had seen in him even when his own vision had been clouded by doubt and exhaustion. The construction sites and cleaning jobs had been necessary steps in his journey, but they'd never felt like destinations. This position at Morrison and Associates felt different, not just a job, but the beginning of a career that could provide both personal satisfaction and financial security. The laptop finally finished its lengthy startup process, and Marcus opened the orientation materials Chen had provided. The company handbook outlined everything from dress codes to vacation policies to professional development opportunities. Reading through it, Marcus was struck by how different this workplace would be from anything he'd previously experienced. At construction sites, communication was direct and often profane, relationships were built through shared physical labor and mutual dependence, and success was measured in concrete terms: buildings completed, projects finished on time and under budget. The corporate environment described in Morrison and Associates' handbook emphasized different values: discretion, professionalism, long-term relationship building, and success measured in client satisfaction and financial returns. Marcus knew he could adapt to these expectations, but he also understood that the transition would require conscious effort and probably some uncomfortable moments as he learned the unspoken rules of corporate culture. The confidence he'd gained from his interview success would help, but he'd need to remain humble and observant as he navigated this new professional landscape. His phone rang, interrupting his reading. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, and for a moment Marcus wondered if Chen had changed his mind, if there had been some mistake or reconsideration that would snatch away his opportunity before it had fully begun. "Hello?" Marcus answered cautiously. "Marcus Thompson?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional but warm. "Yes, this is Marcus. This is Jennifer Walsh from Morrison and Associates Human Resources Department. David Chen asked me to call you this evening to discuss some preliminary arrangements for your start date." I hope this isn't too late to be calling? Marcus glanced at the clock, surprised to see that it was nearly 9:30. The celebration at Elena's had lasted longer than he'd realized, but he was grateful for the call regardless of the hour. Not at all, Ms. Walsh. I'm available to discuss whatever you need. Excellent. First, congratulations on joining our team. David spoke very highly of your interview today, and we're excited to have you aboard. I wanted to touch base about a few administrative details and also discuss our orientation program. Over the next 20 minutes, Jennifer walked Marcus through the practical aspects of his new employment. Start date, benefits enrollment, security clearance requirements, and the week-long orientation program that would introduce him to Morrison & Associates systems, procedures, and client base. One thing I want to mention, Jennifer said as the call was winding down, is that David has requested that you be paired with one of our senior analysts for your first month. This is somewhat unusual for our standard onboarding process, but he feels that given your unique background, you might benefit from some additional mentorship as you transition into the corporate environment. Marcus wasn't sure whether to be grateful for the extra support or concerned that it suggested doubts about his ability to succeed independently. I appreciate any guidance that would help me be more effective in my role, he said diplomatically. I think you'll find it helpful, Jennifer assured him. The mentor we have in mind is Patricia Williams, one of our most experienced analysts and someone who's particularly good at working with clients who are new to wealth management. She's actually quite excited about the opportunity to work with you. After the call ended, Marcus returned to his reading with renewed enthusiasm. The mention of mentorship and the specific pairing with someone who specialized in working with newly wealthy clients suggested that Chen's earlier comments about Marcus's background being an asset weren't just polite reassurances. The firm genuinely saw value in his perspective and was investing resources in helping him succeed. As midnight approached, Marcus finally closed the laptop and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would be his last day at the construction site, a symbolic ending to one chapter of his life and the beginning of another. He'd need to tell his supervisor about his career change, collect his final paycheck, and say goodbye to the men who'd taught him valuable lessons about reliability, teamwork, and the dignity that came from honest labor regardless of social status. But tonight belonged to celebration and gratitude. Marcus thought about Emma sleeping peacefully in the next room, about Elena across the hall who'd invested so much in their success, about Sarah whose memory continued to inspire his determination to build a better life for their daughter. Standing in his small bedroom, looking out the window at the apartment complex where he'd learned so much about community and resilience, Marcus allowed himself to feel proud of what he'd accomplished. The journey from grief-stricken widower struggling to survive to successful professional ready to provide security for his family had been longer and more difficult than he'd ever imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight was for acknowledging how far he'd already come and for appreciating the people who'd made this transformation possible. Marcus Thompson, junior financial analyst at Morrison & Associates, fell asleep with a smile on his face and hope in his heart for the first time in years. 3 months had passed since Marcus started at Morrison & Associates, and the morning routine had settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and miraculous. His alarm still went off early, but instead of preparing for another grueling day of physical labor, he now spent those quiet morning hours reviewing client portfolios and market reports while Emma ate breakfast at their new kitchen table. The apartment they'd moved into was in a completely different part of the city, closer to Emma's new school and Marcus's office. It wasn't luxurious by any standard, but it felt like a palace compared to their previous living situation. Emma had her own bedroom with windows that faced east, flooding the space with morning sunlight that made her laugh with delight every day. The kitchen had modern appliances that actually worked, and the living room was large enough for a proper dining table where they could eat meals together without feeling cramped. Marcus adjusted his tie in the bathroom mirror, still amazed by his reflection. The man looking back at him wore a charcoal gray suit that fit properly, carried himself with confidence earned through months of professional success, and bore little resemblance to the exhausted construction worker who'd once struggled to imagine a different future. His hands were still strong from years of manual labor, but the calluses had softened, and his wedding ring now gleamed against skin that was no longer permanently stained with concrete dust. "Daddy, I finished my math homework and packed my backpack, Emma called from the kitchen, where she was carefully placing her lunch into the insulated bag Marcus had bought her on their first shopping trip after his employment began. The simple act of being able to pack nutritious lunches without calculating the cost of each item had been one of the most emotionally significant changes in their daily life. Emma had adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience that had carried her through their most difficult period. At 7 now, she displayed a maturity that sometimes concerned Marcus, but her joy in their improved situation was unmistakable. She'd enrolled in a dance class that met twice a week after school, something she'd dreamed about for years but never asked for directly. Watching her perform simple ballet positions with serious concentration had become one of Marcus's greatest pleasures. "Remember, Mrs. Patterson will pick you up after dance class today," Marcus said, referring to their new childcare arrangement. Unlike the informal help they'd received from Elena, this was a professional service that cost a significant portion of Marcus's salary but provided Emma with structured activities and supervision until he could leave work each evening. "I know, Daddy. And she's going to help me practice my recital routine. The teacher said I'm one of the most dedicated students in the beginner class." Emma's pride in her accomplishment was evident, and Marcus felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came from being able to provide opportunities that were helping his daughter discover her own talents and interests. The drive to Emma's school took them through neighborhoods Marcus had only observed from a distance during his construction days. Tree-lined streets with well-maintained sidewalks, houses with manicured lawns and two-car garages, children waiting for school buses while parents in business attire headed to their own professional obligations. Emma's school was part of this world now, offering educational opportunities and resources that would have been unimaginable in their previous circumstances. "Have a wonderful day, sweetheart," Marcus said as Emma gathered her backpack and dance bag. "I'll see you tonight, and we can work on that science project together." Emma kissed his cheek with the automatic affection that had never wavered throughout their journey from struggle to stability. "I love you, Daddy. I hope you have a good day at your important job." The description of his work as an important job always made Marcus smile. Emma understood that his position at Morrison & Associates was different from his previous employment, that it carried prestige and financial rewards that had transformed their lives, but she couldn't fully grasp the complexity of financial analysis and client management. To her, the most important thing was that Daddy was happy when he came home from work and no longer fell asleep over textbooks at the kitchen table. Marcus's office was on the 28th floor, with a view of the city that included the construction sites where he'd once worked. The irony wasn't lost on him that he could now observe from climate-controlled comfort the kind of physical labor that had once consumed his days. His desk was organized with the precision he'd learned during his blue-collar years, every document and reference material placed with purpose and accessibility in mind. Patricia Williams, his assigned mentor, had exceeded every expectation Marcus had formed about corporate guidance. A woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked brown hair and the kind of calm competence that inspired immediate trust, Patricia had taken Marcus under her wing with genuine enthusiasm for his unique perspective and rapid learning curve. She'd grown up in circumstances similar to Marcus's own background and understood both the advantages and challenges that came with bringing non-traditional experience to a traditional corporate environment. "Good morning, Marcus," Patricia said, appearing in his office doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the daily briefing materials that would guide their client meetings. "I thought we could review the Henderson portfolio before our 10 o'clock appointment. They're exactly the kind of clients who would benefit from your approach to wealth management." Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully, still amazed by the collaborative nature of his professional relationships. In construction, mentorship had been informal and often harsh, with experienced workers testing newcomers through criticism and practical jokes. Patricia's method was supportive and educational, designed to build confidence rather than test endurance. The Henderson account represented everything Marcus had hoped to achieve in his new career. Robert and Linda Henderson were both teachers who'd spent 30 years living modestly while contributing maximum amounts to their retirement accounts. Now approaching their 60th birthdays, they found themselves with substantial savings but little understanding of how to manage their wealth during retirement. Their anxiety about financial security despite their impressive nest egg was something Marcus understood intimately. They're scheduled to retire next year, Patricia explained, spreading the Hendersons' financial documents across Marcus's desk. They've done everything right from a savings perspective, but they're terrified of making mistakes that could jeopardize their security. Traditional investment advisors have been giving them technically sound advice that they can't relate to or trust. Marcus studied the portfolio, seeing immediately why the Hendersons might feel overwhelmed despite their strong financial position. Their previous advisor had recommended complex investment strategies and used terminology that assumed familiarity with financial markets and instruments that most people never encountered directly. They need someone who can explain their options in terms of real-world impact rather than abstract percentages, Marcus observed. And they probably need reassurance that conservative approaches aren't necessarily inferior approaches, especially for people who've worked hard to accumulate wealth and can't afford to lose it through speculation. Patricia smiled with the satisfaction of a mentor whose student had grasped not just the technical aspects of a situation but the human psychology underlying it. Exactly. And that's why David specifically requested that you take the lead on this account. Your background gives you credibility with clients like the Hendersons that traditional advisors often struggle to establish. The meeting with the Hendersons took place in Morrison & Associates' main conference room, a space designed to project competence and stability rather than intimidation. Marcus had learned to read potential clients during their first few minutes together, observing body language and listening for verbal cues that revealed their comfort level and underlying concerns. Robert Henderson was a tall man with graying hair and the kind of patient demeanor that suggested decades of working with teenagers. His wife Linda was smaller and more animated, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing and hands that moved expressively when she spoke. Both of them carried themselves with the dignity that came from meaningful work and strong personal values, but their tension about financial planning was immediately apparent. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, thank you for meeting with us today, Marcus began, offering handshakes and settling into his chair with the relaxed confidence he'd developed over months of similar interactions. Patricia has filled me in on your situation, and I want to start by saying that you've done an exceptional job preparing for retirement. Many people in your position would love to have the financial security you've created through consistent saving and smart planning. The compliment was genuine and had an immediate effect. Linda's shoulders relaxed slightly, and Robert leaned forward with increased attention. Marcus had learned that many clients, especially those who'd accumulated wealth gradually through discipline rather than high salaries, suffered from imposter syndrome when dealing with financial professionals. We appreciate that, Robert said, but honestly, we feel completely out of our depth when it comes to managing this money during retirement. Our previous advisor kept talking about aggressive growth strategies and market timing, and it all sounded so risky for people our age. Marcus nodded understanding. That's a completely reasonable concern, and I think we can address it by focusing on what you actually need rather than what theoretical models suggest you should want. Can you tell me about your retirement goals? Not in terms of investment returns, but in terms of how you want to spend your time and what kind of lifestyle you're hoping to maintain. The conversation that followed was exactly the kind of interaction Marcus had envisioned when he decided to pursue this career change. Instead of discussing abstract financial concepts, they talked about travel plans, grandchildren they hoped to spoil, volunteer work they wanted to pursue, and the peace of mind that came from knowing their basic needs would always be met. Linda described their dream of spending winters in a small beach town in Florida, while Robert talked about his interest in woodworking projects that he'd never had time to pursue during his teaching career. Both of them emphasized their desire to be generous with their adult children without compromising their own security. Those are wonderful goals, Marcus said, making notes that would help him design investment strategies aligned with their actual priorities rather than generic recommendations. And the good news is that your savings are more than adequate to support that lifestyle if we structure your portfolio appropriately. The key is balancing growth with security in ways that let you sleep well at night. Over the next hour, Marcus walked them through conservative investment approaches that prioritized steady income and capital preservation over maximum returns. He explained concepts like asset allocation and diversification using analogies drawn from their own experiences as teachers, comparing investment risk management to lesson planning and classroom management strategies they'd used throughout their careers. Patricia observed the interaction with evident satisfaction, occasionally adding technical details or answering specific questions about implementation, but largely allowing Marcus to guide the conversation. Her confidence in his abilities had grown steadily over their months of collaboration, and she'd begun recommending him for increasingly important client relationships. "I have to ask," Linda said as the meeting was concluding, "you seem to understand our perspective better than other advisors we've met with. Have you worked with many teachers before?" Marcus smiled, recognizing the question as an opportunity to connect on a more personal level while maintaining professional boundaries. "I haven't worked specifically with teachers, but I understand what it's like to worry about financial security while working in a profession that's essential but not necessarily highly compensated. Before joining Morrison & Associates, I worked construction and went to school at night while raising my daughter as a single parent. I know what it feels like to save every possible dollar and worry about whether it will be enough." The revelation had exactly the effect Marcus had hoped for. Both Hendersons visibly relaxed, and the formal atmosphere of the meeting shifted to something more collaborative and trusting. "That explains a lot," Robert said with obvious respect. "We've been dealing with advisors who seem to think everyone starts with trust funds and inheritance money. It's refreshing to work with someone who understands that most of us have to build wealth slowly and carefully." By the time the Hendersons left, they'd agreed to transfer their entire portfolio to Morrison & Associates and had scheduled follow-up meetings to implement the conservative strategies Marcus had outlined. More importantly, they'd expressed the kind of confidence and satisfaction that Marcus had learned were the most reliable indicators of long-term client relationships. "Outstanding work," Patricia said as they returned to Marcus's office. "You connected with them in ways that would have taken me months to achieve, and you did it while demonstrating technical competence that exceeded their expectations. David is going to be very pleased when he hears about this meeting." Marcus felt the familiar satisfaction that came from professional success, but it was different now than it had been during his first few months at the firm. Initially, every positive interaction had felt like validation that he belonged in this environment despite his unconventional background. Now, success felt more natural, less like proving himself and more like utilizing skills he'd developed through experience and training. The afternoon brought a different kind of challenge in the form of a new client consultation with Jeremy Walsh, a 35-year-old technology entrepreneur who'd recently sold his startup for 8 figures. Unlike the Hendersons, whose concerns centered on preserving wealth they'd accumulated gradually, Walsh needed guidance on managing sudden wealth that exceeded anything in his previous experience. Walsh arrived at Morrison & Associates offices in designer clothes that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly salary, driving a Tesla that represented the kind of conspicuous consumption that newly wealthy individuals often embraced. But his nervousness was apparent despite his expensive accessories, and Marcus recognized the anxiety that came from having resources without understanding how to manage them responsibly. "Mr. Walsh, congratulations on your successful exit," Marcus began, using the terminology he'd learned for describing business sales to entrepreneurs. "That's an impressive achievement at any age, and I imagine it opens up possibilities you're still processing." Walsh laughed, running his hands through carefully styled hair. "That's putting it mildly. 6 months ago, I was living paycheck to paycheck and eating ramen noodles 3 times a week. Now I have more money than I ever imagined possible, and I have no idea what to do with it. Everyone I know suddenly has advice about investments and business opportunities, and I don't know who to trust." The situation was one Marcus had encountered several times during his months at Morrison & Associates, and it required a completely different approach than his work with the Hendersons. Where established wealth needed preservation strategies, sudden wealth needed foundational education and protection from both external exploitation and internal impulse decisions. "That's a completely normal reaction," Marcus assured him. "Sudden wealth can be overwhelming, especially when it changes your entire life situation essentially overnight. The good news is that you're being smart by seeking professional guidance before making major decisions. A lot of people in your position make expensive mistakes by acting too quickly." Marcus had learned that newly wealthy clients often suffered from imposter syndrome similar to what he'd experienced during his own transition from blue-collar work to professional employment. The key was helping them understand that wealth didn't require them to become different people, Just more strategic people. Can I ask about your background before the business success? Marcus said. I find it helps to understand someone's relationship with money and risk before we start talking about investment strategies. Walsh described growing up in a middle-class family where financial security had been a constant concern, working through college to avoid student loan debt, and spending years developing his technology skills while living in shared apartments and driving used cars. The startup had been his first real entrepreneurial venture, and its success had surprised him as much as anyone else. I keep waiting for someone to tell me it was all a mistake, that I don't really have this money, Walsh admitted. And I'm terrified of losing it through bad decisions or trusting the wrong people. Some of my friends think I'm crazy for not buying a mansion and a yacht immediately. Marcus nodded with understanding that was both professional and personal. That cautious instinct is probably what helped you succeed in business, and it's going to serve you well in managing your wealth. The fact that you're not rushing into major purchases suggests you understand the difference between having money and having sustainable financial security. The conversation continued for over an hour, covering everything from tax implications of Walsh's business sale to long-term investment strategies that could provide both growth and security. Marcus found himself drawing on lessons learned from his own experience with sudden life changes, explaining how financial stability was as much about emotional management as technical portfolio construction. One thing I learned during my own career transition, Marcus shared, is that dramatic changes in circumstances can be disorienting even when they're positive. It takes time to adjust your self-image and decision-making processes to match your new reality. There's no shame in taking things slowly while you figure out what kind of wealthy person you want to be. By the end of the consultation, Walsh had agreed to begin with conservative investment strategies that would preserve his capital while he adjusted to his new circumstances. More importantly, he'd expressed relief at finding an advisor who understood his psychological challenges as well as his financial needs. I was expecting someone who would try to sell me complicated products I didn't understand, Walsh said as they concluded the meeting. Instead, I feel like I found someone who gets what I'm going through and wants to help me make smart decisions at my own pace. The day's final task was a team meeting where Marcus presented his analysis of market trends affecting Morrison & Associates' client base. These presentations had initially been intimidating, requiring him to synthesize complex economic data and present it to colleagues who'd been working in financial services for decades. But over time, Marcus had developed confidence in his analytical abilities and his unique perspective on client needs. The most significant trend I'm seeing, Marcus told the assembled team, is the growing number of clients who've achieved wealth through non-traditional paths. Technology entrepreneurs, skilled tradespeople who've built successful businesses, professionals who've climbed corporate ladders starting from entry-level positions. These clients have different needs and concerns than inherited wealth or traditional high-income professionals. He presented data showing how this demographic was becoming increasingly important to the firm's growth, along with recommendations for service modifications that could better serve their unique circumstances. The presentation was well received, with several colleagues asking follow-up questions about implementation strategies. David Chen approached Marcus after the meeting, wearing the satisfied expression that had become familiar over their months of working together. Outstanding analysis, Marcus. Your insights about emerging client demographics are exactly what we need to stay competitive in this market. I'd like you to lead a task force developing specialized services for non-traditional wealth accumulation. The assignment represented both recognition of Marcus's contributions and an opportunity for career advancement that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Leading a task force would require him to work directly with senior partners and potentially influence company-wide policy decisions. As the workday concluded, Marcus found himself reflecting on the transformation that had occurred not just in his professional circumstances but in his fundamental understanding of his own capabilities. The man who'd once doubted whether he belonged in corporate environments was now being asked to help shape the future direction of a prestigious financial services firm. The drive home took Marcus through the same neighborhoods he'd observed during his morning routine, but now he saw them with the eyes of someone who belonged in this community rather than merely aspiring to join it. Emma's school was among the best in the city, their apartment was in a safe neighborhood with excellent amenities, and Marcus's professional reputation was growing steadily within Morrison and Associates and the broader financial services community. Emma was waiting for him with Mrs. Patterson, practicing ballet positions in their living room with the concentration she brought to everything that mattered to her. At 7, she was developing interests and talents that would have been impossible to nurture during their period of financial struggle, but she'd retained the warmth and resilience that had sustained both of them through their most difficult times. "Daddy, watch this." Emma demonstrated a new routine she'd learned in dance class, her movements precise despite her young age. "Miss Jennifer said I have natural grace, and if I keep practicing, I might be ready for intermediate classes next year." Marcus applauded enthusiastically, remembering his own childhood when opportunities for enrichment activities had been luxuries his family couldn't afford. Being able to provide Emma with experiences that could help her discover and develop her talents felt like one of his greatest achievements. "That's beautiful, sweetheart. I can see all the practice you've been putting in." Marcus settled onto the couch, grateful for this daily transition from professional responsibilities to personal fulfillment. "How was school today?" Emma launched into detailed descriptions of her mathematics lesson, a science experiment involving plant growth, and the book her class was reading together. Her enthusiasm for learning was evident, encouraged by teachers who had the resources and support to make education engaging and comprehensive. "Mrs. Patterson helped me with my homework, and we made a healthy snack with vegetables and hummus," Emma reported. "She said my reading level is above grade average, and she thinks I should ask my teacher about advanced books." The update filled Marcus with satisfaction that went beyond pride in his daughter's academic progress. Emma's intellectual development was flourishing in ways that would establish foundations for lifelong learning and achievement, opportunities that had been made possible by the career change that had initially seemed so risky and uncertain. After Mrs. Patterson departed, Marcus and Emma settled into their evening routine of dinner preparation and homework assistance. Their kitchen conversations had evolved from his exhausted responses to her questions about basic assignments to collaborative discussions about increasingly complex academic concepts. Emma's curiosity seemed limitless, and Marcus found himself researching topics alongside her to ensure his explanations were accurate and comprehensive. "Daddy, can you help me understand this science project about ecosystems?" Emma asked, spreading her materials across their dining table. "I need to create a diagram showing how different animals and plants depend on each other." Marcus examined the assignment, recognizing it as more sophisticated than anything Emma would have encountered in her previous school. The project required research, creative presentation, and analytical thinking that would challenge her developing academic skills while teaching important scientific concepts. "This looks like a great project," Marcus said, settling beside Emma with enthusiasm for the collaborative work ahead. "Let's start by talking about what you already know about how animals and plants interact in nature." Their discussion continued through dinner and into the evening, with Emma asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated her engagement with complex ideas. Marcus found these educational conversations to be among the most rewarding aspects of their improved circumstances, representing not just Emma's intellectual development but his own ability to provide guidance and support for her learning. As bedtime approached, Emma's energy finally began to wind down, though her mind remained active with questions about her project and plans for the next day's activities. Marcus helped her organize her materials and prepare for another productive day at school, marveling at how dramatically their daily routines had improved over the past months. "Daddy, are you happy with your job now?" Emma asked as Marcus tucked her into bed, her expression serious with the kind of perception that children often displayed about their parents' emotional states. The question caught Marcus slightly off guard, though he realized Emma had probably been observing his transformation from stressed and exhausted to satisfied and energetic. Her ability to notice and process such changes demonstrated the emotional intelligence she developed through their shared experiences. "I'm very happy with my job, sweetheart," Marcus confirmed. "I get to help people make smart decisions about money, I work with colleagues who respect my ideas, and I'm learning new things every day. Most importantly, it lets me provide for you in ways I always hoped I could." Emma smiled with satisfaction, her concerns apparently resolved by his reassurance. "Good. I like it when you're happy when you come home from work." and I like our new apartment and my dance classes and my new school. Everything feels better now. After Emma fell asleep, Marcus spent time reviewing client files and preparing for the next day's responsibilities. But increasingly, these evening work sessions felt like professional development rather than desperate cramming, evidence of his growing confidence and competence in his chosen field. His phone buzzed with a text message from Elena Rodriguez, who maintained regular contact despite the distance between their old and new neighborhoods. The message contained a photo of cookies she baked along with an update about activities in their former apartment complex, maintaining the connection that had been so crucial during Marcus's most challenging period. "Miss you both," Elena's message read. "But so proud of what you've accomplished. Emma looks so happy in the pictures you shared, and you look like the professional man I always knew you could become." Marcus smiled, typing a response that conveyed his gratitude for Elena's continued friendship and his commitment to maintaining their relationship despite changed circumstances. The distance between their current lives was measured in more than miles, but the connection forged through shared struggle and mutual support remained strong. Before heading to bed, Marcus walked through their apartment one final time, still amazed by the transformation in their living situation. Emma's bedroom with its eastern exposure and space for a proper desk where she could do homework. The kitchen with appliances that worked reliably and enough space for them to cook and eat together comfortably. The living room where they could entertain guests and where Emma could practice her dance routines without feeling cramped. But more than the physical improvements, Marcus was struck by the psychological changes in their daily lives. Emma woke up excited about school rather than worried about their family's stability. Marcus approached each workday with enthusiasm rather than desperation. Their conversations focused on opportunities and possibilities rather than limitations and concerns. Standing in his own bedroom, Marcus looked out the window at a neighborhood that represented security and opportunity rather than merely shelter from immediate crisis. The view included trees and well-maintained buildings, evidence of a community that invested in long-term quality of life rather than merely surviving from month to month. The transformation from construction worker to financial analyst had required more than acquiring technical skills and professional wardrobe. It had demanded that Marcus reimagine his own identity, expand his vision of what was possible, and develop confidence in abilities he'd always possessed but never fully utilized. Tomorrow would bring new clients, challenging analytical projects, and opportunities to continue building his reputation within Morrison & Associates and the broader financial services community. Emma would attend dance class and work on her science project and continue developing into the confident, curious young person she was becoming. Their lives had found a rhythm that balanced professional achievement with personal fulfillment. But tonight, Marcus allowed himself to fully appreciate the magnitude of what they'd accomplished together.